Hello and welcome. I wanted to do a better intro than the one you're about to see, but I haven't done it yet because I've been working on a ridiculously complicated video for me. The long and short of it is I did a teaser short for an ESP32 in the form of a M5StickC with a multimeter, and it was a 60-second video, and so far something approaching 1,500 people, possibly more by now, have apparently watched this, which for a small new channel like myself is quite daunting. So before people get super angry about me essentially clickbaiting, it's time for me to come clean, explain what I'm doing, and release the full video. So let me introduce the world's best, most rubbish idea. No, really, I think I'm onto something here. Or not. As you can tell, it took me ages to think of a name for this thing. You'd be surprised what names already exist, and surprising still is that nobody has called anything by this name yet. So obviously it was a worthwhile 5 minutes of work thinking it up. But let's get to the meat of the video. I imagine a lot of you subscribe to the multitude of channels that mess around with various synths out there. And me too. My favourites I'll link below. The kit in these channels, it ranges from do-it-yourself to approachable to downright unaffordable. And honestly, among my favourites is Look Mum No Computer, who is absolutely legendary. He's been doing this for years and he's really knowledgeable. And I watched that and I think, well, on my to-do list definitely is to just build myself an actual analog synth at some point. But it's quite a big undertaking. There's a lot of components there, and you have to source a lot of electronic parts. You've got a lot of soldering. I'm pretty good at electronics, but I don't know anything about synthesizers. But why would I let that get in the way of making a YouTube video about synthesizers, right? So with that in mind, everything I say from this point on may be entirely wrong, and probably is. But obviously this is a learn as we go kind of series, so feel free to correct me in the comments, and please do correct me in the comments, because first of all, I need to hear it. Second of all, interaction. So, what would happen if you built, from the ground up, a digital synth, but in the style of an analog synth? Let me explain what I mean. Take, for example, your average analog synth. It's diagram time. Now here's a very basic analog synth, about as basic as you can get. Well, not quite, but this is the Atari Punk console. If you know anything about synths, you've probably at least heard of this thing. It consists of two 555 timers. These are just simple oscillator chips that generate an on-off state, and I know about these because these were in my A-level electronics course. So yeah, these are simple oscillator chips that generate an on-off state, which in the context we're using here, kind of a square wave. One of the oscillators is producing an audible frequency square wave. The other one, well, more on the square wave thing in a minute anyway, because some surprises, but I don't want to spoil it. The other one is creating a short trigger blip that controls the audible one. You've got the left one connected, triggering the right one, if that makes sense. Anyway, I feel like I should build this. Well, that was quick. Actually, it's a pretty simple build. Let's fire it up. Now that's amazing. I mean, actually, it is pretty fun. But let's poke around a bit while we're here. I have this oscilloscope, so we might as well use it. The first thing I want to see is what the trigger waveform is like on this discharge pin, which is connected to the trigger pin on the other 555 timer, because changing this is what you're doing with the potentiometer on the left, which incidentally, according to the circuit diagram, is being shorted across to make a variable resistor rather than a potentiometer, which is an interesting design. Now, this waveform that I've got here on the oscilloscope is really hard to actually see or capture a photo of because the oscilloscope for some reason just doesn't like it. But I managed to get it to behave just enough to get a bit of a picture here with a lot of messing about with the settings and the trigger settings and stuff. I think it's partly just because this is a pocket oscilloscope. It's good, but it's not brilliant. Now, notice here that you are dipping the output to trigger the other 555, and that's because the trigger pin triggers when you hit a low. I think it's below 0.3 volts or something, and it will trigger the second 555 timer. Let's move over to the output pin, which is the one that's driving the speaker, and this is the one I'm really interested to see because this is the actual waveform that this synthesizer is generating, and very little is said about this. Most of the resources online say square wave, so this is anything but square. Have a look as I mess around with this. Just look at some of the waveform shapes and how they change. This just goes to show that you can't always take for granted what you're told on the internet. And I mean, even I just said it a few minutes ago, that the Punk console outputs a square wave. It certainly doesn't seem like it, does it? So, well, that's an oscillator circuit. But here's the thing, right? This is where we're going with this. It was a cool demonstration and a bit of fun. What if, instead of that left potentiometer there, what if we replace that with an input voltage? What then? If we had another oscillator feeding into this? Well, enter the LFO, which is short for low frequency oscillator. Not that it necessarily has to be low frequency, but they do tend to be so that they can fiddle around with your waveform in real time and you can hear it. The way it works or can work is that your LFO is an input to the main oscillator, and it makes a waveform that's lower than your main oscillator and can be as low as 1 hertz or less, which is 1 wavelength per second, 1 cycle per second. And it can be fed into the oscillator in all manner of ways, but most often something like amplitude, which means volume, or frequency, which means pitch. Fundamentally, that's it, really. If you imagine you're able to control the frequency of the waveform with another oscillator running a lot lower, you're suddenly going to get a waveform out that's a lot more exciting to the human ear. Instead of a simple sine wave, you might get a wobble noise, or just a rising tone if your LFO is running slowly enough. I'm just going to briefly pretend to be an LFO with my hand. I suppose technically I am. Imagine putting a very slow sine wave in. Would it sound like this? Now that's where I want to stop with this theory for the moment, because this is the part I've been working on, the LFO. Now, one of the problems with videos like this that rely heavily on coding is that code is boring. I mean, that's not fair. Coding is not boring, but explaining code to someone is boring. And I don't think you'll find many people who will argue with that fact. It's actually surprisingly hard to construct a narrative out of a page of code that you've written previously. So we'll feel our way through this, and I'll try to keep it informative enough, and I will put the code up on GitHub if you feel any need to look closer at it, or you're welcome to use it. Now, as I mentioned, I started out prototyping on the M5StickC, and the main reason I did this, well, firstly, it's a really cool platform because it includes a battery and uses USB-C, and it works out of the box. I also was planning to use the screen for something, but as it happens, I moved on before I got that far. But it also has hardware buttons, and if you buy the right starter kit like I have, it comes with a amp and speaker, which is obviously advantageous for our purposes when messing about with audio. For the record, I think these things are amazing, and here in the UK it cost me about £17 even for this full kit, which is not that much more than the price you'd end up paying if you just wanted an ESP32 with a monochrome OLED screen. So I'm a big fan of what M5Stack are doing with these things, but I'll leave all that to a future video, future videos about the M5Stack. I've already made a couple of videos about the M5Stick, if you want to watch them on my channel. So back to synthesizers. Obviously, when you code things, you don't just jump in and write all the code. You do a few tests first as a proof of concept to see if the hardware can do what you want it to, and whether you understand what it's doing. I was actually pleasantly surprised that programming an ESP32 is almost exactly like Arduino. And by the way, the reason I chose to use an ESP32 for this job is very simple. Speed. The ESP32 has enough power to be able to raw output waveforms, which I have no doubt that the Arduino could do, but I didn't want to be fighting it for CPU cycles. I'm not into that kind of thing. I want to be able to write my code how I want and have enough slack to be able to edit it later or to add extra stuff without having to re-engineer it. And the ESP32 definitely has enough slack, but more about that in a minute. First thing I did was I coded a sine wave. I managed to get hold of some code online that generates a sine function within the parameters that the DAC, digital to analog converter, needs to output. That's between 0 and 255. Bear in mind that a true sine wave does run plus or minus either side of 0, but we'll casually ignore that for now. You can see that there's not a lot to this code. All it does is generates values and pushes them out of the DAC. This is on pin 26 on the ESP32. To be precise, the ESP32 has 2 DACs, but the one on pin 26 on the M5StickC is linked up to the plug-in speaker, so it seemed like the obvious choice to use. This is what it sounds like when you run that code. And this is what it looks like on the oscilloscope. I was glad to see this was working, but obviously this is just a single tone generator, and it's a totally random pitch, which proves that the ESP32 can output a custom waveform fast enough, but it's not really any kind of LFO. Interestingly, to digress for a moment, I want to mention that what I'm doing here is a little bit perverse compared to how digital audio waveform generation is normally done. If you know your Nyquist Shannon, I'll link below a video by Technology Connections, which is amazing. But yeah, normally audio is not generated anything like this. As you can see in my diagram here, I'm generating a waveform quite literally point by point. And because I have enough points, 12 in this case to be precise, per wavelength, it gives you a good approximation of a sine wave. The more points you put in per wavelength, the closer it will approximate a sine wave. But this is incredibly inefficient from a microcontroller's point of view because you're having to do a lot of work per wavelength. I have no doubt I'll need to visit this later when I get onto main oscillators, or perhaps I won't actually, but potentially. But the LFO is a much slower oscillator, so it's quite happy and potentially more powerful or flexible if I do push out 1 point of a waveform at a time at high resolution and high speed. Digression over. Next, I tried to use interrupts. Now, if you do Arduino and you're scared of interrupts, then you need to just sit down and get to grips with them because they're absolutely necessary for any time when you want to do things either at a specified interval or while doing other things at the same time. Put simply, interrupts are the key to multitasking on microcontrollers. The ESP32's implementation of interrupts might look a bit hard to understand with the terminology, but it is dead easy. You literally create an interrupt with a time delay, you tell it what function to run when that time delay has happened, and then off it goes. I'm still using 12 points in this example, and I've set the interrupt interval as low as possible to see how far I could push it. What I have here is one interrupt that says push out the next dot on the waveform, the next point on the waveform, and that's all it does at the moment. Every time the interrupt fires, it logs it, and then the main loop puts out another value from the array of sine values, and that's it. So we're still on a single frequency, but we can change that by changing the interrupt interval. If you look at this diagram, you can hopefully see that shortening the time between interrupts will increase the frequency, and conversely, the more points you have in the waveform, the lower the maximum frequency will be. So they are inversely related to each other. Anyway, this code sounded like this, and the waveform looks like this. Hello, it's me from the future, and this is me without a script, so I'm sorry. Basically, what happened here was I ran all the tests initially when I wrote the code, and I thought that the maximum frequency the DAC could put out was 6.5 kilohertz, and I just got it completely wrong. I think there was an error in the code. The long and short of it is that I've had to just re-record this because the calculations changed. So we'll plow through and I'll explain why. So if you look at the calculation I've done here, the maximum frequency that we could achieve is around 1.1 kilohertz, and that's pretty good actually considering how we are doing this. We aren't using the technology that the ESP32 specifically has to dump sound out of its DAC. It's called I2S, and I don't want to get into it because we will have to get into it down the road later, I think, when we do proper oscillators, because we'll want higher frequencies. For the moment, Don't worry about it. So if you do some maths, you can figure out that the maximum sample rate that the DAC can put out in this code, which is important to say in this code because, of course, everyone can say, oh, you can optimize it by doing this, that, and the other. The code is very simple. The maximum operating limit is 1,111 times 12, as you can see on paper here, 13,000 samples per second, which honestly is a bit lower than I expected. Because I have seen people online stating that the DAC can run a lot faster than that. So I'm a little confused about that, but it's important to say that, you know, we have to keep some perspective here. It's not worth spending ages trying to figure out why that is when you're dealing with an LFO and you don't really want this kind of frequency anyway. So at this stage, I don't care. So let's move on back to me in the past. To test this out, because I was curious, I stuck a literal loop in the code to make the ESP32 count to 1,000 between every single point it put out. So I was trying to slow it down, but it didn't change the output waveform. So, well, the ESP32 clearly is capable of doing a lot more, a lot faster, than putting values out of the DAC. Why? Well, I haven't worked that out yet. Sure enough, I could halve the number of samples per waveform, but at 6 samples per waveform, I don't think it would look like a sine wave. It would look like a wonky square wave. But anyway, it's a moot point at this stage because I don't need to generate 6.5 kilohertz anyway. So it's a problem for later. But speaking of square waves, I also hard-coded in functions to generate square and sawtooth waves here, and they looked like this. Now, obviously, at this point, I've pretty much shown that this is actually going to work. We've got plenty of spare CPU cycles to do other stuff, and the waveform is coming out pretty good. So really, we need to just add some control to it. And this was pretty simple. In the next piece of code, I added 2 functions. The first one I created was a second interrupt function for one of the buttons on the side. When you press this, it does a bit of filtering from multiple presses and just says, OK, change the waveform, which cycles through 4 waveforms that I've defined. Those are sine, square, sawtooth, and a custom one I did just to demonstrate the advantage of pushing waveforms out this way. I can make any waveform I like. And if you increase the resolution down the line to more than 12 points, this could get really powerful and interesting. The second change I made in the code was to wire up 3 pins of an encoder to the remaining available ports on the M5StickC. If you're not familiar with encoders, imagine a sort of digital potentiometer, but it's not a potentiometer. Instead of feeding out a resistance value, it feeds out 2 out-of-phase square waves as you turn it. And if you look at the 2 outputs, you can work out which way the knob is being turned and how many turns. So it's not based on absolute position like a potentiometer, it's instead based on rotational movement. I could do a future video on how encoders work because they are really cool, but we don't need to know here because there's actually a pre-made library that deals with it as a black box on the ESP32. Link it below. It even sets up its own interrupt handlers, and it's actually amazing. I can't believe how simple it was to implement. It was just a couple of lines of code. So we end up with this contraption here, that you can turn the encoder to change the frequency, and press the button to change the waveform. I know we're still running at audible frequencies here, but this is because I'm working on the basis that if it works at higher frequencies, it will definitely work across the whole range that I need. There's no technical difference. In fact, it's better if it has a top limit in the kilohertz because it will be more flexible in the long run, even though that's not where it will be generally used. I'll probably end up increasing the sample rate and running from something like 0 to 1 kilohertz in the end. I guess this will allow me up to about 70 samples per wavelength, which is probably way more than you need, but who knows, that is what we're going to find out, really. Now, as I mentioned, I was going to try and put something on the screen, but it was becoming obvious that I've hit a kind of limit at this point as to how many exposed ports there are, especially when I've got the audio add-on plugged in, because it blocks quite a few ports. So the writing's on the wall that I probably need to take this onto a breadboard with a standard ESP32 chip at this point. I'm still going to be using a screen, but I'll be using a tiny cheap OLED instead, so I didn't think it was worth investing any time into coding anything for the M5StickC screen, as it would need to be re-engineered for the OLED, because they use a totally different library. I should mention, though, that everything I've done so far can be literally uploaded straight onto a normal ESP32, as I'm about to do, without having to refactor anything at all. But this part is going to have to wait for part 2 of this video, because this video has been long enough already, I think, and I've covered a lot of ground. And instead of spending ages making a long video that becomes quite tedious, I'd rather break it up into 2 parts, get this one out, and I can focus solely on making a good part 2. So without further ado, I'll wrap this one up, and I'm going to call it a success because actually pretty much everything I tried to do worked first time, which is really unusual for hardware stuff. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, and if you're looking forward to part 2 as much as I'm looking forward to finishing this thing and getting it working, then please subscribe. Also, I do videos on all sorts of things that seem to fall into specific buckets like 3D printing, electronics, Python coding, and I guess other stuff. So if you find any of that interesting, then also make sure to stick around. Please comment if you have anything to say. I don't get many comments at the moment, so I will reply to any questions or criticisms. And with that, thank you for watching, and see you in part 2 shortly.